I mean, if you can't leave the room, I'll get someone else.
So I think we're going to try and draw people in a little bit. And then... Wow. Tom.
Who's your son? Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think I did. Like,
Oh, okay.
Tom Ray came just to hear you.
What's it?
Hear you.
I know, I just texted.
All right, it is my great pleasure to start this discussion. James may be finding his way here, so for now we have 3 people, and 2 of whom I'm not sure have been on a Silicon Flatirons panel before. So welcome Angie Cronenberg from CompTel, the Competitive Telecom Association. Harold Tietz is at TW Telecom at least for a few more months, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So then we'll see as that company ends up part of Level 3. Presumably that deal goes through. And then Dan Caruso, the founder and CEO at Zayo Communications, with Zayo, TW Telecom, and Level 3, and then companies like CoreSite. Tom Ray's here. There's a lot of exciting fiber happening here in Colorado, fiber network plays. Of course, Century Link is a established company in the region, formerly known as Quest, formerly known as US West. We're happy to have James here with us as well. The conversation on disruptive innovation is very interesting in each of these sectors. So obviously electricity has certain dynamics and questions tended to be more often about what might happen or could happen. In telecom, we have had a 30-year journey that we are celebrating this year, which is the breakup of AT&T. For students, when I teach, it is humbling to me. I feel old. They don't even recall that there was an integrated AT&T. The idea of an AT&T monopoly, the Bell system, it goes over their heads. I have an interesting Bell system memory myself, which is in my family, I was taught to invest in the stock market, and my mom and grandmother recommended buying AT&T before divestiture would be a good investment. And it was a reasonably good investment, at least for a little while. There's a lot of exciting activity happened. I want to start on that note and start from the regulatory perspective. We'll sort of oscillate between regulation, technology, and business. Regulation at some level has to decide whether or not to embrace disruptive innovation. In certain environments, regulation quite clearly decides to embrace stasis, stability. That is obviously a familiar tradition in Europe, where I believe Uber is now banned in Germany, for example. Where in this country, starting with the AT&T consent decree, something that was viewed as heresy to many observers, we decided that the regulatory framework was going to embrace technological change, disruptive innovation, and competition. From people who've lived through it from different angles, I'd love to get your reflections. Dan, maybe you can start off.
Yeah, so I actually started out my career at Illinois Bell just after the AT&T breakup. Illinois Bell was part of Ameritech, which was one of the 7 baby bells. I then stayed with their 7 years and then joined MFS Communications, which was one of the very first competitors to the Bell system. So building fiber optic networks that were metro in nature and using those to compete against the Bell system. As part of that, I then led the effort for MFS to get into competitive switch services, and then was, as part of all that, part of the very early stages of the internet as well. So my vantage point has been pretty significant. I also lived through the WorldCom bust and all the other fun and games as well. It's funny, I think you used the word that we embraced competition. Some people did. I'm not sure the Bell system embraced competition because a lot of times when the regulatory rules were set, they would look to try to be as responsive as they could get away with looking while still achieving what they really wanted, which was to naturally protect their monopoly. So when they would look for something, they would make concessions, but then as they were getting what they wanted, they try to pull back or make those concessions not all that practical to use. The last thing I'll say in my opening comments is Zayo Group, which is a company I'm part of now, after all the learning I did about all the regulatory fun and games, we tried very hard to design a business plan that was not subject to a lot of regulatory upside or downside. Try to be regulatory neutral just because it's hard to deal in that world.
But MFS was dependent on regulators enabling MFS to interconnect and provide services that were complementary to the established firms.
100%, 100% dependent. And the first phase of that was called, was referred to a couple different words, but competitive access provider was one of them. And it required being interconnected to the Bell network so that as you were using fiber to deliver a transport service, it typically had to go somewhere else. And when competitive fiber networks were in their infancy, you always had to go to the Bell network. So there had to be interconnect rules in place at that level. When it went to competitive switching or CLEC, competitive local exchange, it was a whole different competitive paradigm that had to be created. One of the absolute pioneers for leading all of that from a business standpoint still lives in Denver, mostly in Denver, Arizona as well, Jim Crow down in Denver. He was the founder of both MFS and Level 3, and he and his business associate Royce Howland were the two of the absolute leaders in making those changes happen from a competitor standpoint.
So James, how long have you been in CenturyLink, sort of seeing the story from that side?
And I'm gonna say this a little tongue in cheek. So I was 7 when the divestiture happened, and I've taken the opposite career plan apparently from Dan. I was too young to invest in AT&T at that time, and when I started working, I started in technology companies that were not considered telcos. So I was not living in a regulated environment. I spent several years there, happy and joyful, and then I went and did some work for AT&T in the early 2000s. But the part of AT&T I was working for was mostly the internet backbone team. So again, regulatory concerns and policy weren't really something that I was concerned with. And then I started with a company called CenturyTel in 2004, which was a local exchange carrier or telco. So this was my first experience in the regulatory world. And then through merger and acquisition activity, we're now a company called CenturyLink, as you stated. And that was through acquisition of a few companies, including Quest, which was US West, which was a baby Bell. And so I've gone the opposite path of Dan, and I've gotten myself more entrenched with this regulatory environment. I'd say Dan was smarter than I am, and he got out.
But you're younger than me, as you pointed out.
I have to still get to learn my mistakes, I suppose. But to answer the question around policy and innovation, one of the things I think that I'd like to see us kind of talk about here is when the split happened and kind of in the spirit of creating a competitive environment, you have to take those things in a snapshot in time. At the time, if you look at what AT&T was and the concept of they were building the equipment, they were selling the equipment, they were the only game in the country. It was the right thing to do. I think what's happened though is, and much like what we just kind of listened to with the electricity conversation, things have to evolve because now you've kind of shifted the needle of how competition works, and so innovation based on policy is really a snapshot in time. And in this case, it's which decade do you want to focus on?
So you're living in a company now that lives in a more traditional regulatory world, some remote areas that benefit from universal service subsidies and don't have a lot of competition, to you guys bought Savvis, and so you're living in that internet backbone world, which is, like you said, outside regulation. one of the challenges for companies, and you hear this a lot about electric utilities who are sort of in one category, is how to have a culture that can be entrepreneurial and dynamic versus one that's more oriented around, okay, what will the regulators let us do?
Yeah, so that's a great comment, and if you see kind of the moves that we are trying to make in that space around innovation, is the customer base is going to get there with or without us. So obviously we want to be there and be part of that, part of that experience and part of that solution. And if you look at what's happening, a lot of the regulatory and policy-based focus is around the traditional services, or what I call legacy revenue service, dial tone. Well, we all know that's going away. There isn't anybody in my company.
Is there a date you guys project the traditional landline dial tone is 0? Has anyone said publicly?
I think that's a wild guess, to be candid with you, and it's all around demographic and it's around generation. So as you look at generations, fewer people have home phones.
So no one, just to give you, I know people in my telecom law class are here, I asked them, not a single person has a landline phone.
That's right.
Except for me.
And it's a generation thing.
Yeah,
right.
and Andrew.
I still have one, but it's, and I love it.
You kind of
No, that's fair.
and that's been an interesting question because for a while there, wireless service was viewed as like a fringe service. Angie, let me bring you in the conversation because you remember these times. When the 1996 Telecom Act was being implemented, there's a question about what's the competition to the incumbents. And for a while, the answer was, well, wireless, that's like a niche service. You can't rely on its reception.
And there weren't that many wireless players.
And there weren't that many wireless.
Right. In fact, it was a duopoly up until the commission actually implemented the auctions around the mid-90s. And that required Congress, an act of Congress in 93, right, to say, you know what, this whole competition thing, that's really much better. Look what's happening in the long distance market. So we want to encourage that in the wireless market. And they told the FCC, go auction spectrum for the very first time. And that was kind of a big hump for the FCC to figure out how do we do this, who's going to show up. Well, it turned out there were a lot of players who were willing to show up and invest in the wireless market. And everyone thought it was just going to be voice service, right? I mean, I did. In fact, I remember the first time I heard about a camera being in a phone, and I thought, who's going to want a camera in a wireless phone? Just goes to show you don't count on me for predicting what it is the consumers are going to want. And, we go from it just being phone service to then people are more interested in texting, they're more interested in sending their photos, now they're interested in the internet, all coming over their mobile wireless device. But what's interesting, what you might see in the residential marketplace happening isn't necessarily going to translate directly in what's happening in the business marketplace. How many of you in your businesses still have a phone at your desk? I do. And that's mainly what I use to communicate with my members with, is I pick up my phone. Now, if I'm on the go and I need to talk to a member, like right now when I'm here traveling to Colorado, I'm using my wireless device. So it has become, the choices can be greater, but you have to look at what are the needs and what is it the consumer's trying to do with that choice. What we see right now is the commission kind of really struggling with the various marketplaces, how to judge it business versus residential. And if you pay much attention to what the FCC does, and I do, I've spent my entire career in the policy arena. And I'll give two personal anecdotes. I was 12 in 1982. I was old enough to pay attention to the news, and I remember having a conversation with my mom about this, like, what is all this about? What is the news talking about? And her trying to explain to me what antitrust law is and why they decided to do the breakup. Fast forward to 1994, and I was interviewing for a summer associate position with Phil Revere, who was the lawyer who filed the lawsuit at the Department of Justice to break up AT&T. Little did I know that I would go on to work for him and spend a good portion of my early part of my career learning at the feet of someone that even Judge Green calls really the father of modern communications law. Phil is now one of the senior advisors to FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, and what we see the FCC struggling with at this moment is what has changed and then what hasn't changed. What regulations still need to be in place to ensure that competition is going to thrive? So that's what I spend most of my days doing, and we can talk more details as we follow up.
Harold, let me follow up with you because you fit this sort of arc that Dan set up. You're at a company right now that lives in the competitive world,
Yes.
having to compete against the incumbents in an environment where the policy goal and the intention of the regulators is to promote competition. Chairman Wheeler just gave a speech on that, and his general counsel, John Stout, had a blog post where he noted Phil's history, and John, who like Bill Levis here, was a former MCI person. So we're part of this journey that the AT&T breakup represents. From your perspective in TW Telecom, how would you give some flavor on what's the benefits of kind of living this world and how it feels being in the middle of it?
Well, let me first of all say that, like Dan, I'm actually much younger than he is, but I went through some of the same experiences, MFS, et cetera, et cetera.
He looks like $1 million. Come on.
Yeah,
I got a little bit of a Google search to do here.
yeah.
Keep going.
But anyway, the point is that I actually went through many of the same things that he described, and except I also ended up back in an AT&T role at one point in my career. But back to your question, I think that's an important one. For us, it's the importance of the competition, as Angie points out, is absolutely one of the most key components of all the things we're going to be talking about, in my opinion. And that is that in spite of, or as Dan puts it, even because there are ways to circumvent some of the regulatory conditions that have been placed, there still is a tremendous need for oversight, especially, and I know Chairman Wheeler mentioned the last mile as being one of the key points in conversation about regulation or non-regulation, or another way to say it, can you maintain competition without some oversight? And I'll also say that as I'm both the CIO and the CTO of our company, so I'm both a provider of service to myself, and also I'm a provider as well as a consumer. And that's kind of good and bad. You can imagine if something goes wrong, I have nobody to blame but myself. So that's supposed to elicit a little bit of humor there. I guess it didn't. Anyway, the point being there is, as we have, from a customer perspective, because I am both a customer and a supplier, the important part of this is that customers are demanding and not just saying, we'd like to have, they're looking for features and capabilities. And today, with innovation, we're literally providing those capabilities on our network. But if we can't do that and provide similar services in call it an off-net world, or in a trading partner or a service provider partner, then we can't provide that ubiquitous service, because today with customers, we're talking about multi-node or multi-campus environments across states, and even across the world. So what is it we're going to do? What needs to be done to maintain that for companies like TW Telecom and others that want to maintain a competitive equilibrium, if I can use that term, because today it's not so, even though we would like to think so.
So I want to pick up that point and jump to a question that I had in my mind. And Dan was provocative by saying Zayo's business model doesn't depend on regulation to be effective. Harold has suggested that may be less true for his company, and a classic form of regulatory oversight, which we also celebrate anniversary this year, is interconnection. Mm-hmm. So 1984 was when AT&T was broken up. 1914 was the Kingsbury Commitment, when AT&T had the first government oversight that mandated interconnection. And so a question that I'd like people to talk about is, can you have competition and disruptive innovation that comes with it without interconnection, or is interconnection a way that incumbents can use their customer bases as a club by denying access so that they remain, let's say, immune from some of the competitive pressures? How do we think about interconnection? James, do you want to start off from the sort of incumbent perspective? When you guys think about talking interconnection, because it's obviously a topic that's going to continue to get talked about, and right now we have interconnection, traditional landline, so-called PSTN, wireless is a different interconnection world, internet is yet another different interconnection world.
Yeah. So, I think I think what you're seeing is, and this is actually, I don't know if everybody realizes kind of the dynamics we have on this panel. So I believe I'm the only one that's got the traditional Lech or Arbach ties to my current company. I think that's fair. And
Our biggest customers.
and you know, I think one of the things that goes to show what's happened with interconnection is we've essentially so let me kind of lay it out. We have the last mile, we have the infrastructure, and based on how interconnection works, companies like Zayo or TW can come along and you know, essentially purchase services across that infrastructure and serve customers what I think Harold used the word off net, that would be on net to me. So I am the serving connection into that facility. And we lose business. We lose, you know, just candidly, we lose business to Zayo, we lose business to TW, and vice versa. And I think that's the spirit of creating that competition. I still believe that the models have to evolve. And again, it's based on the fact that I look at it as almost like an incubator, right? So no doubt, if I have the infrastructure and I've got this great footprint and I'm getting subsidies from the government, I do have an advantage. At that time, I have that advantage. As the needle shifts, you could argue that he can be more nimble with what he wants to do with his business model, or Harold can be more nimble with what they want to do with their business model, or as I still have legal hurdles I have to overcome. So for example, I may have to set pricing a certain way to enable competition. So if CenturyLink has one business unit and another business unit, I have to make sure that I'm appropriately charging those two business units, even though we trade under the same, you know, stock symbol. And that's so Dan can't come along and say, well, CenturyLink bought the service from themselves for $3, but they're trying to charge me $25. It kills competition. I think that where we are today in terms of success, competition, and candidly, the ability for non-regulated companies to go and actually serve the customer, I think that we have to rethink all of that.
There's really so much that can be said about interconnection right now. I'm going to focus on the voice interconnection. You know, it wasn't really that successful prior to the 96 Act. In fact, the cell phone companies were having some difficulty. If they were the non-incumbent telephone company, they were getting charged really high rates to interconnect with the incumbent telephone company. And the congressional staff recognized that and said interconnection has got to be a legal requirement. The incumbent telephone companies don't have an incentive to price this in a way that is going to, you know, incent investment, incent competition. So they set up a regulatory system, encouraged you guys go negotiate. And if you can't negotiate an agreement that's a reasonable agreement, well, then the competitors can go to the states and have the states arbitrate. The other option is once there's been a dueling out of a negotiated agreement, then it's got to be filed and other carriers have got to be able to opt in. And that's really important for encouraging, kind of lowering that that barrier to entry for competitors to be able to just opt into those agreements. But interconnection also has been tied so much up with the USF system. In fact, you know, because of the rates that were being charged from one company to the next, which helps support service to areas that are really hard to serve, you kind of can't really talk about interconnection rates without also talking about USF. And it took the FCC, how many years? 2011 is when the FCC finally started to unwind this and put the companies on a track to get down to what we call bill and keep, a zero rate that's going to be passed back and forth. So they're not going to charge. And that's what wireless has been now for a long time. And you see what has happened in the wireless industry. Instead of the back and forth charges to each other, they're investing in their own networks, right? Hopefully that's what will now that we're on this track, get there for voice services. In the meantime, the commission has had to struggle with, all right, you've extracted it out of the ICC regime, but how do we ensure that service in the hard to serve areas, as you were describing, where you're going to rely on your landline, how are we going to ensure they have that universal service? And the commission has that in process as well. So I wanted to raise that.
This is a fabulous one, because when you talk about disruptive innovation and competition, that destabilizes the status quo. one of the longstanding status quo commitments that the Bell system committed to. So Theodore Vail, who took over the Bell system shortly after the Kingsbury commitment, said, one system, one policy, universal service. He hardwired the idea that we're a protected monopoly and we serve all at reasonable rates. Once you start undoing the monopoly system, the question is, are you threatening universal service? That, for the last 30 years, has been a big tension. And only a few years ago have we started to say, you know, we're going to try to really get rid of interconnection as a means to advance universal service goals. We're going to interconnect at truly cost-based rates. In this case, we're not going to charge either of us anything. The temptation to play games with interconnection to advance social goals is considerable. In electricity, you hear about this in the distributed generation, right? You're going to charge the utility or charge the customer based on what methodologies. There's so much room to address different goals that depending on how the regime is set, it's going to hurt or help one part of the ecosystem or another. Harold, do you,
Oh, sorry, I was going to add, I want to draw a quick parallel here so in the traditional sense, right, that's where we were. If you think about what's happening today, and I'm talking about, again, innovation, what's driving traffic, excuse me, and we may, this may be part more of the internet panel, but interconnection in terms of data connectivity, it's the same debate that we're having today, and that's actually been a model that's been a lot less regulated, right? There's no regulation around internet peering. And so you see the public commentary around over-the-top traffic like Netflix and Google, YouTube, versus carriers like myself or Comcast or Verizon, for example. And it's really a similar concept. Netflix states that this is what the pricing model should look like for their content to be consumed. The carriers say this is what it should look like for it to be consumed, and then the consumers get stuck in the middle of that debate from a financial standpoint.
well, so this another point of interconnection. I'm glad you raised it, and I guess I'll come back to Dan on this one because he started by saying he's not too worried about this in his current company. Is when they don't agree and there's no government oversight, you end up with an outage. And many people here may have heard of the company Cogent, who's been part of more than a few of these chicken games, right, where they're threatening to send traffic. The other company says we're not going to provide the circuits for, so you'll end up not getting to us and vice versa. Those became pretty ugly incidents because they couldn't agree within a non-regulated framework how to interconnect. So Dan, when you say you don't worry about this, is that because you're confident it'll get worked out, or because you think no matter how it gets worked out, it's not going to have much impact on your business, or maybe as you're getting bigger, you're starting to worry a little more about this?
Harold, that 37-year career you had in telecom, when did that begin?
LinkedIn and everything.
Curious.
The child prodigy. I was about 8 years old. Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Now the
Modern day
math works.
Doogie Howser.
Yeah.
So Zayo has an internet business that is, if you take our internet and our Ethernet business at Zayo, it's about similar size as Cogent's business. Cogent's primarily in the internet and Ethernet business, so we're kind of, to some degree, in a similar situation as Cogent is, and we have 100% free peering status, which is kind of the threshold to be considered a tier 1 provider. So we do have to navigate our way through the issues described with internet peering. We have to be very cognizant of the balance of traffic, about how relationships work with others who are your competitors, as well as there's a dependency on one another. So I might be being a little bit too casual when I say we have no dependencies. What we try to do is not build a business plan around that's predicated on a regulatory kind of situation that I've learned are never stable over time. So we try to build the business and navigate our way through it without getting into disputes, without trying to pressure other people to do what might not be natural to them. But you have to navigate through that carefully. What was interesting about Cogent example is, and I'll use level 3. Several years ago, Cogent level 3 got into major flare-up, where, if I understood it correctly, level 3 wasn't augmenting its capacity to Cogent's liking. More recently, level 3 got into a dispute with Comcast, because Comcast wasn't increasing their capacity to level 3's liking. So level 3 was able to argue both sides of that argument just 2 years apart, if I understood both of those correctly. So it depends what's in your economic best interest as to what position you take. But like I said, I've learned the hard way that the best way to navigate your way through that is not build business plans that are predicated on regulatory structures.
The markets are slightly different though, right? One could say level 3 probably had other options besides Cogent. They want to move their traffic. They could look at other transit providers to move it. Who can they interconnect with? But when you're talking about getting to the actual customer, the viewers, those with the eyeballs or the ears, and there's a service provider that offers that service to that customer, they're in the position to be the terminating access monopoly. And so the question is are you going to let that provider use that power to then extract whatever the price is that it wants in order to have the interconnection? What the commission decided on the voice side now is, you know what, this doesn't make a lot of sense anymore for one to charge the other. It really should go to bill and keep. And we're on our way to doing that. And I think some of the benefits that we're going to see is instead of the gaming that can happen, right, you're going to see more investment in the networks versus the gaming.
If I could jump in on that, because I think that's an oversimplification with all due respect. We also have a wholesale voice business that's not part of Zayo, but reports into our holding company that I've overseen for several years. And it's the profitable business, generates cash flows, but it lives in that whole regime of moving minutes around and this and that. There's no silver bullet answer. Bill and Cleat is nothing close to silver bullet answer. One thing that's happened through all this regulatory process is there's been enormous gaming of the regulatory situations. Enormous. It was with internet access through managed modem type services. You could game it if it was bill and keep. You could game it if it wasn't bill and keep. And the type of gaming changed, but tons of money changed hands. That was all because of regulatory attempts at doing good things, but they were unable to control the marketplace. They created big opportunities for some and big losses for others. And that continues to this day with wholesale voice. And it continues to stay with access, with the kind of stuff that TW Telecom has to deal with a lot of every day. So I don't think bill and keep's an answer any more than anything else is an answer.
It's better than the artificial world we had lived in. So certain rural exchanges, say in South Dakota, who might charge 10 cents per minute for terminating access, gave rise to all sorts of artificial incentives. Bill and keep, there'll be less of that, although to pick Dan's point up, if you have to interconnect, the place you interconnect and the amount of money that gets charged for the links that do interconnection, that get augmented or not, that becomes the new locus.
Can I give a quick story? So in the very early days of interconnecting switched local networks, I was at MFS and we were working with Ameritech at one of the first ever, this is pre-Telecom Act, so helped shape the Telecom Act. Andy Littman was the guidance behind it, but I was the lead for MFS negotiating with Ameritech, and we wanted bill and keep. That's where money doesn't change hands when you exchange minutes. They wanted a very high recip comp rate, which I think was 9/10 cents a minute, which was high for that type of traffic. We said, are you sure? Because if you really want that, we're going to sign the deal and it's going to be 9/10 a cent. Are you sure? They thought they had the biggest victory in the history of the Bell system. What happened was we ended up creating these dial-in internet access networks, we call them managed modem, where everyone who was going on AOL and dialing in was dialing in our phone numbers. Every time one of those calls was completed, we got 9/10 cents a minute. I mean, if you looked at level 3, and then we repeated that at level 3, if you looked at level 3's revenue during the telecom meltdown, so Ike is in the room, what was it, 25-30% of it was managed modem service? Ike headed up that, he was the technical genius behind it all. It saved level 3 through its darkest period, all because of a regulatory situation that we took advantage of, and we equally could take advantage of it if it was bill and keep. It's just hard to regulate these things.
So, Harold, you had teed up this question about the need and value of regulation. Interconnection is this core, lasting policy goal. What do you see as the role of interconnection in this changing universe?
Well, let me say there, I view the interconnection that we've just discussed from a voice and data, an peering arrangement. That's heavily market-driven, as we just talked about. But I also look at the access as an interconnect as well. And we do that through various methods, but especially with the new technologies of connecting network-to-network interfaces. And that's where I believe there's the most exposure, if you will. I think, as Angie mentioned, there's only one termination point, if you will. In this arrangement we just talked about, there could be many. We can pull plug on one particular rogue, or someone is trying to arbitrage, or whatever it happens to be. There's a way around that. But when we're talking about the last mile connection into a customer, there isn't much alternative. It's typically going to be the LEC, or perhaps somebody that's actually built some fiber network. So with the fact that we're still at a disadvantage, and I know James and I probably would have an arm wrestling discussion over this one, but
You weren't listening to me when I answered the question first. Everything's fine.
yeah, exactly. But that's why I say we'll arm wrestle later. But the point is that the fundamental concern here is for customer. And everything that I say, I think about it from the customer's perspective, and that is they need to reach that location, and they happen to be our customer, and we don't have facilities there. And the only way we can make a deal work for a 50-site deal, whatever it happens to be, is that primarily most of it has to be on our network, and then the off-net component, where the margins are so slim, we have to make up for that. So what should regulatory oversight do? It just basically help us maintain a competitive equilibrium in that, because right now there could be, again, given the, and I know James just mentioned a retail and a wholesale division in their group, where we deal with the wholesale side very heavily. And typically, as you look for pricing, it's going to be very close to retail. So it's going to be very difficult to maintain competitive positioning in those kind of things. So we're forced, not forced is the wrong word, I should say, we rely heavily on our on-net service to make these deals work. So and customers are saying to us all the time, we want choices. We want to be enabled by you, TW Telecom, to be an alternative to the other guys. They also are asking for us, give us new capabilities, give us that innovation. We want control of our network services. We want to manage our business without having to come to you or whoever and ask for new capabilities. Or we don't want to have to go to you and say, I want another 10 meg. Well, I have to wait 30 days or whatever the time frame is. And that's, in my opinion, if we want to talk about true disruption, the true disruption is going to be changing the model from what we call today, we call Telco 1.0. It's very much the same methodology of service delivery that we've been doing for the last 100 years. The new model, the next generation model, is more Google-like, more Amazon-like, which is on demand but instantaneous or near instantaneous gratification, if you will. That's really disruption, in my opinion. The technologies that we've gone through here, in fact, I could have been a contrarian and said, I don't believe we've seen a lot of disruptive change in our business. Technology has changed, yes, and has helped our cost model, yes, and has provided new features, yes, all those things that we'd like to say, but it hasn't really changed the telecom world. I would argue probably not much.
Well,
I would agree with.
So that's perfect, because that's the next topic, which is how much has disruptive innovation changed telecom? Some people would say AT&T breakup. We have an AT&T company, which has a lot of market share. We have Verizon, which is a lot of the Bell companies. Let's have some reactions. James, you want to take that first?
Yeah, so if you think about telecommunications as it is and the innovations that have come from it, it's really been focused the last several years around moving more of the same at higher capacities and higher speeds and bit rates. And so there hasn't really been a change other than just scale, right? So we talk about the bandwidth consumption that happens across the general global internet. You go from 2 to 4 terabits per second of backbone, for example, in 1 year. That's the innovation that we're talking about, but that's not innovation. That's just getting bigger pipes, better equipment, faster processing. The innovation that you've seen in telecommunications has really been driven by companies that are riding across these networks. Smartphones, tablets, the Uber, you used Uber as a great example. That's innovation in terms of how you think about telecommunications. Is it connected? Yes. Is it using telecommunications for their infrastructure? Yes. But was that done by one of these 3 or 4 companies? No. And so I think when you spend your time focused on the competition of what was your core business, you may lose some of the cycles to think about innovation of what the next portion of your business should be.
So Dan, how much different is what you're doing from an innovation perspective to what, let's say, Illinois Bell was doing in the 80s, or for that matter, MFS was doing in the 90s?
A lot. And let me first point out that I sort of agree with you, but I also sort of would challenge your basic premise. What I agree on is you said things are changing dramatically. Okay, we got the internet, we got Uber, we got Google, we got Amazon, we got all these things. That doesn't happen if the infrastructure
That's right.
hasn't innovated
Completely agree.
dramatically year over year over year. That dramatic increase in capacity in fiber that enabled all these things that we take for granted in today's life, it's because of innovation at the infrastructure layer. It's not because of status quo. The thought that that would have happened had we have kept the Bell system intact, it wouldn't have. You're right, because the Bell system wouldn't have innovated, but there wouldn't have been the infrastructure to allow others to innovate. There is one example, though, that I find particularly interesting, and it's AWS, Amazon Web Services. Amazon was a bookseller. So Amazon, a bookseller, goes out and develops a cloud service. Not just a cloud service, the biggest, more prevalent cloud service. That's something we should have developed, not a bookseller. They innovated not on top of what we do, but they kind of innovated right smack in the middle of what we thought was our purview. And they did it very differently and very effectively, differently than we would have, and very effectively as a result. That, to me, is like more of a curious one, like, how come they did that, not one of us? The kind of innovation we do at Zayo, we coined kind of a new type of approach that we call bandwidth infrastructure. It's a recognized term in the industry now, but when we got started, it wasn't a recognized term. We coined that term. Frankly, we borrowed the business model from some smaller companies that we saw were having tremendous success. So we're not a CLEC, we're not a competitor to the Bell system like a TW Telecom is, or a managed services company. We're focused on innovating at the infrastructure layer. And we innovated a lot. And I think if you look at what we've done and the results of it, you get a sense of what that's really meant.
So let me stick to this question, by the way, because when people ask how innovative and how truly disruptive the telecom world can be, you have to say AWS came from outside. Dial-up ISP providers, AOL, came from outside.
Right.
A lot of the innovation was not generated by the incumbent players. Why is that? Harold, did you have a thought on that?
Let me just say, and the fundamental, I believe, disruptor has been the applications.
That's right.
And if you look at all the examples we're talking about, it's that they've taken telecom and they've applied, either call it over-the-top players, or they've created applications using the telecommunications service. And the innovation, if you want to, I'll kind of lower my standards of what innovation is. Let's say that innovations, as we're talking about, were driven heavily by the application. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, that's kind of the chicken and the egg. Well, we provided basic capabilities, but the application guy said, well, wait a minute now, that's great, but we need, using TW Telecom vernacular, we've got a need for dynamic capacity. We have a need for dynamic prioritization of classes of service. We have a need for dynamic connections, things that we can manage. Again, going back to the customer, things that we can control. That is, if you want to say anything, is a disruptor to the traditional telecom model. And that's why I say, as we look at the next generation of telecom, it's going to be based upon truly changing the way services are delivered and how and when and for how much. Because we didn't talk about, the cost models and the charge models and things like that. But things are very cyclic, and we're heading back into that again, where usage-based this and that is becoming even more predominant. So
All right, James, we're going to get the audience involved. Yep.
Yeah, so what's interesting is we all said something very similar yet very different, and that's kind of fascinating, because I think my commentary around not innovating from an infrastructure standpoint was really in saying we were reacting to capacity and speeds. Did we have to have innovation to make that happen? To your point, absolutely we did, right? The capabilities on silicon, the capabilities in speeds and feeds and densities, that has grown. But the driver was really the applications, as Harold said. And so when you look at innovation, it is chicken and the egg, is what comes first? It's kind of the same concept of the computer. You started off with 512, you go to 640 memory, now you're up to gigs. You add more gigs of storage and memory to your computer, eventually something comes along and consumes it. So then the computer systems have to get innovated or upgraded. I think one thing that and Harold touched on this, is you're talking about, you're alluding to the intelligent network Time Warner Telecom has. Those are all things that are started to happen. Zayo's come along doing the bandwidth, right? And we've got Savis, and that was in response, honestly, to the cloud space. And so what you're seeing now is
That's because you guys didn't do AWS, so you bought a provider.
we buy a lot of things, and so
Is that a threat?
An opportunity?
no, it is not. But the concept is that we are to a point now in industry where, because I think of how we view competition, we have the ability to start thinking about innovation. For us, it was acquisitions and integration of those services. So it's integration of applications like AppFog, which is a company part of Savis, or CTS is what we call it, CenturyLink Technology Solutions, tied into the network. And so it's tying those things together, because infrastructure by itself to the end user is not as compelling as that end-to-end service. Sorry.
That's great. Angie, you want to jump in?
Well, I was just thinking that if you had someone from the cable industry here, they might have a slightly different viewpoint of what's driven the investment in their networks. And what makes me think about this is what the chairman was talking about last week. He observed that, with the 92 Cable Act, that allowed for the new entrant, the satellite providers, to get access to the video programming that was largely owned and controlled by the cable companies, was significant in providing that video competition. And once that happened, then cable had to invest more in their networks to offer the digital, right? Satellite was coming in, they were already offering digital. They had access to the program as a result of a regulation. They upgraded their networks. When they upgraded their networks, they could begin offering cable modem service. So then you see the ILECs say, well, we need to upgrade our networks and offer DSL, so that you can see how a basic regulation, then how that influences things in the marketplace that probably if you'd asked the legislators and the staffers in 92, so if you do this, what do you think is going to happen? And they would have said, oh, well, they'll get access to video programming. That'll be really good, right? Then you'll have more competition in the video programming market. But they probably couldn't have predicted how it was going to change the investments in the networks. And I think that is sort of a fascinating case study of how, looking at where is the market broken and where should Congress or the FCC intervene to fix the market, make access available to a building block for competition, and then let it go, and then see what happens.
The thing about, and Harold's been talking about this access and having to purchase from the last mile provider. Cable's a perfect example of that. You have the option to purchase from cable or the traditional LEC. And so I think when you look at what's happened there is cable largely coming in from a non-last mile regulatory standpoint gets to build last mile, and then you have the ability to purchase from them as last mile.
There's some certainly truth that the availability of cable, but in terms of the service quality and all the things that are necessary for us to manage our network, there's still a lot of work.
Prefer us?
No. Absolutely. No.
And they tend not to have the ubiquitous network
Exactly.
that you have.
Fair enough.
Because when they entered the market, it was largely residential side that they were
That's right.
interested in as compared to the business areas.
Exactly. That's where I was going,
That's
yeah.
a fairly significant difference as well. And we talk a lot about that in Washington. I'll spare you from hearing the full pitch on that. But I think it is, we have a question, but I think it's sort of fascinating to look at, a regulation that I think no one can can necessarily know what the end result will be, but yet how that basic building block to competition, if you address that issue, then it really does allow for the innovation to happen in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise.
That was true of the AT&T breakup. It was not easy to foresee all the ways in which you'd have competitive access providers and sonnet rings, which became popular afterwards. So there's a lot that happened. It's hard to predict. All right, first question to a student. We have none for my telecom law class. I'm not afraid to call on one. Let's just volunteer. Yep, Bill, thanks.
So, increasing use of the internet has disrupted telecom regulation. Do you think it's possible to regulate the type of data use efficiently? Like some packets are used for calling up a web page, whereas other packets are used for text messaging or voice services.
So one of the big challenges is the way services are priced. And the legacy is that voice was priced at a premium rate, data much cheaper. That's created a problem for lots of companies who are losing voice revenues. Is there any way to preserve those distinctions?
Are you talking, I get the question that you mentioned from an internet perspective. So essentially you're talking about.
In the internet world that we're living in today,
Yes.
if you try to charge more for voice, can you preserve it? You're shaking your head no, James?
Candidly, I just, and this is James's opinion, it's not CenturyLink's opinion, but I don't think so. I actually believe that in the world we live in today, people have very polarized opinions, no matter what the topic is, and there's an expectation that everything is treated equally. And if you're trying to game the system in a way as a provider to say, well, you essentially incentivize them to try doing something different. And if you look at the wireless carriers, for example, they're switching voice over to IP transmitted voice. I think the new iPhone announcement talked about voice over LTE is now native in this device. You're going to start seeing the focus on pure traditional voice diminishing, and then what you have to get into is all traffic is now data traffic. It's all IP traffic. And now do you start charging per application? Because that's really what you're talking about. And you quickly get into the scenario of net neutrality, the scenario of does video cost more than voice? Does this video cost more than that video? And as the bit rates keep going up, it's kind of a losing proposition. And again, that's my opinion of where we are.
And then you have regulators, right, struggling with this aspect of it, and especially as it relates to public safety, being able to access 911, and the politics in Washington are such right now that even having a discussion about what open internet policy means is a very, very hard conversation to have. And you see the commission who struggled with it, well, let's try it this way, and the court slaps them down. Let's try it that way, the court slaps them down. I think generally there's agreement that people should be able to access what they want to access on the internet that's lawful material, and people should be able to be connected. But how public policymakers actually ensure all of that happens, and what pieces of the statute they may rely on, what new pieces of statutes might need to be enacted, I think it's just this debate is going to continue, and we're going to keep for a while, at least another 10 years, in my opinion.
Other questions? Let's go up here to Bob, and then we'll get one more back there.
I guess you could almost observe in all three of these, the internet and the telecom and the electricity, not so much electricity yet, but I suspect it's coming, that the regulatory framework is nothing more than an incentive to avoid it, to innovate around it. I just wonder that all the advances that we've come to seem to outrun the regulation. This is not a statement of intent of anybody who's trying to regulate it, but it just seems to me that the pace of innovation in this world is just outstripping the ability to manage it, and that. So I just wonder if there's a panelist view of this. I was dying to ask this from the electricity grid, because it seems to me that there's a whole other world that's going to be coming that telecom has experienced and the internet has experienced, but technology hasn't developed to do it on the electrical grid.
I'll repeat in case people in the back didn't hear it. It's a very provocative question. The basic point is that is the regulatory framework simply something that's an invitation to innovate around? Does it just create incentives for different types of innovation? And what is the implication, if that's the case, for regulators developing regulations? Dan was shaking his head the whole time, so I'll say Jim Crow said at this forum a while back that regulation in telecom should be like garlic in cooking. You use it, but carefully and to a limited degree.
I like garlic, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I agree with your premise that Bob, that things are changing so rapidly that attempts to regulate often produce very different outcomes than anyone anticipates, and that the pace of that is accelerating and will continue to accelerate. I took what you meant to be a little bit different than I think, Phil, what you had repeated, in that I thought what you're getting at is the objective of the regulator in that environment, because there's a need for regulation. It's, there's no solution by which regulation isn't part of it. Right. But the intent of the regulators needs to be, instead of trying to control everything, which in a lot of cases they've tried to do too much of, it's how do we use regulation to kind of spur innovation. So a light regulatory hand, but with a stated purpose, not of trying to manage the outcomes of everyone involved and all lobbyists, but to kind of push us toward giving many companies the incentive to innovate more. That's what I took you to mean, and I think that would be
Just
a good answer.
Let's just say quickly. I know, Harold, you want to say? I think you want to say something.
I do, yeah.
I think the answer is yes, it is outpacing, because if you think about specifically in the internet world, the things that were in the news that everybody was up in arms about 2 years ago, such as privacy, are the carriers looking at what you're looking at? All the hype around that, and then creates all these cases. Nothing ever really comes from that before the next thing comes along and is my video traffic being treated fairly, or am I going to have to start paying per megabit based on a certain application? And we still haven't solved the prior discussions. And before that, it was voice over IP offered by a third-party company across a traditional voice carrier's network. None of those things have really gotten down to a solid, here's the rules around that before the next one comes along. Sorry, Harold.
No, that's good. My comment is kind of very much like Dan's in terms of light regulation, yes. But I think in thinking about it, as long as the criterion is it promotes competition, it does encourage innovation, but it also is very much a stimulus for the right kinds of behavior. And I know that's very loosey-goosey and very much like cloud. It's very, it can be misinterpreted. But I think fundamentally, you're right. I think what happens is in a regulatory environment, because it becomes so rigid and it becomes so onerous, that people find ways around it. And you're going to have arbitrators no matter what you do. Their arbitrage is a big business in any world, and especially when you lay down certain laws or you make certain, like rural communities are a target for arbitrage services, because you can terminate there at a more profitable way. And so those are the kind of things that I look at.
Policymakers are always trying to catch up. I found that to be the case when I was at the FCC. There's so many things that have been pending for so long, decisions that just not made, and then you see the staff just sort of like throw their hands up. And here now we're talking, I've spent the last 6 to 8 months responding to white papers out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee who seriously consider taking up a rewrite. And they've seen enough changes, enough innovation. They're like, look, we think we really need to reopen the 96 Act, which still sounds really young to me, but it doesn't to the 20-year-old staffers on the Hill. So, we're going to see, I think, and especially if the Senate changes hands in November, we're going to see a really serious consideration by Congress on a rewrite. And the last one took a number of Congresses to happen. and probably it would take that again, but you're going to be involved in these discussions. These companies that are going to be continuing to try to invest and plan and innovate and compete, then are also going to be worried about what's Congress about to do, and how's that going to change, and how am I going to respond? And so these are hard, difficult issues.
Do you want to ask your question real fast? Yep, right back there.
Would you please comment on a municipality owning access networks, in particular internet access, of course, and how that plays into how you guys see things?
Well, I'm strongly opinionated on that topic. I am, plug your ears, I'm a capitalist. I believe that that we shouldn't be using tax dollars to kind of build businesses that are owned by local municipalities. I think that's been done in the past. A lot of taxpayer money has been wasted significantly on that, and there's still attempts by some communities to try to do that going forward. Let competition solve that. Now, you want to make your right-of-way more available. If you have some conduit more available, that should be something communities are very proactive on, not as a source of trying to extract money from those who are trying to build fiber deeper into those communities, but to instead spur economic growth, because more broadband, more bandwidth, closer to people's homes and businesses spurs economic growth. I think it's been abused, and a lot of taxpayer money has been flushed down the drain.
So 1 minute, anyone want to take the other side?
Well, I was going to say, we haven't had a position on uni broadband itself. I'll give my personal opinion, if that's okay. I think, and when I was working for Commissioner Clyburn, we would have discussions with localities that were just frustrated. They were frustrated with the providers that were there and wanted to look at other alternatives. I usually said to them first, reach out to every provider that's in your area and talk to them about the needs of your community, because I think there are a lot of companies like yours that want to provide those kinds of services, and that there are some barriers to entry that municipalities could lower, states could lower, et cetera, et cetera. It makes sense to me that when there's private investment already in the community, that you would leverage that versus leveraging tax dollars to provide those systems. And that said, I think some of the state laws that have created a situation where it's not even easy for a private investor to build. I mean, we need to reconsider those things. We need to recognize the benefits of broadband networks generally and how they can help our communities across the board with respect to education, with respect to healthcare. And thinking about it more holistically is something that I think all policymakers should do. And that's one of the things that I worked on whenever I was at the FCC. It's one of the things that I hope maybe I can keep working on when I'm at ComTel, but we haven't taken a real active role in this particular debate, but it is an ongoing debate. In case you're not aware of this, there are a couple of petitions pending at the FCC to preempt state laws in this area that create barriers that make it more difficult for municipally owned networks to expand into areas that are not within their own territory. And so I think we're likely to continue to hear news out of Washington. This chairman seems very interested in addressing this issue to get to his competition, the speech that he did last week. How do you improve broadband competition to residential and the business marketplace? So stay tuned. There are organizations in Washington that are working this issue quite hard and want to see the commission act on it. On the other hand, I think we're beginning to hear the other side of it. And so it's just going to be an ongoing debate over the next year or so.
Just one of our first acquisitions at Zayo was Memphis Networks. We paid $6 million for Memphis Networks. We got $40 million worth of network. Guess who paid the other $34 million?
City of Memphis?
City of Memphis. Guess how much they got for that? Zero. They wasted $34 million of taxpayer money.
Well, on the contrary side, if you look at what Longmont is doing, with respect to their metro rollout of fiber and what they've invested, what their total business would be, versus what the
So we're not going to accuse debate now. It's a great topic for another occasion, and I look forward to that. I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. Thanks very much.